The Society for Culture and Environment extends a warm welcome. You are watching a session on the Path Ahead Transformative Ideas for India from the Bhopal Literature and Art Festival, January 2019. We have with us Mr. Rajiv Mehrishi, 13th Comptroller and Auditor General of India and Vice Chairman of the United Nations Panel of External Auditors. He is a retired IAS officer of the 1978 batch belonging to the Rajasthan cadre. Mr. Amitabh Kant is an IAS officer of the 1980 batch and currently the CEO of Niti Aayog. Ms. Ila Patnaik is an Indian economist and former principal economic advisor to the Government of India. Mr. Santosh Mehrotra is a human development economist. He was an economic advisor in the United Nations system and a technocrat in the Government of India.
Welcome to all of you. The way we want to organize this panel discussion is as follows. We have only a total of say 45 minutes. And there are 4 speakers. So one implication is that none of the 4 of us can sort of really manage to speak for more than 9 to 10 minutes overall, which we will itself break up over the 45 minutes. And unfortunately, since the time is limited, we will not really have much of a time to sort of open it up to the floor. But let me make some preliminary remarks, no more than 5 to 7 minutes myself. And I really want to sort of congratulate Mr. Kant for this book that he has edited, which has already been introduced, and I'll make some references to it in my remarks. But I want to sort of make initial 3 comments in respect of what could be, as we move forward into beyond the 70th year of our independence, what could be truly transformative ideas for India. Some of them, of course, are in the book. But the first point I think all of us need to keep in mind is that we are well past the midpoint of our demographic dividend. The demographic dividend is defined as that period in the life of a nation where the share of the working age population is rising and the share of dependent population, meaning under 15-year-olds and under 60 years old, is falling. This is a period in the life of any nation which comes but once in the life of a nation, and this will end in 2040. Now, what characterizes this period is a rising share of young people entering into the labor force. My estimate is that about 5 to 7 million new young people join the labor force, but there are millions in agriculture who want to and need to leave agriculture, who must also be found work. There are millions who are already unemployed, who must also be found work. So actually the number of jobs that the economy needs to create is much more than 5 to 7 million, rather than young entrants into the labor force. And giving jobs to youth is absolutely essential, and any transformative idea must take this fact into account. Second, the history of development in the post-war epoch teaches us the following. As Simon Kuznets showed in his work long ago, Nobel Prize winning economist, that development involves the transition out of agriculture into industry and then into services. That implies 2 changes. One, that the structure of output changes in favor of industry and then in services, and the share of agriculture in output declines. The second dimension of that is that the share of employment in industry and services rises and the share of employment in agriculture falls. Unfortunately, both these processes have been extremely slow in our economy, so any transformative idea which doesn't put up front and center this kind of structural transformation is not a transformative idea. We really need to achieve this transformation within the next 20 years. We don't have that much time. Unfortunately, since the economic reforms began, 1991, the share of output in manufacturing has remained 16%. Only 16%. In China, it is in the region of 35%. In Thailand, it is much higher. So they completed their structural transformation very early. Not completed, but really got a head start. And my second point, which brings me to my second point. In other words, I'm already hinting that the East Asians had a certain strategy. The Chinese had a certain strategy which enabled them to hasten the pace of their structural transformation, which the Latin American countries did not have, which the African countries did not have. The result of this is that in the last 40 to 50 years in Latin America, those economies in Latin America, most of them are highly primary commodity dependent. Primary commodities still constitute a very high share of output, not manufacturing. And similarly, of course, for Africa. The trouble is that the East Asians raced ahead of all of us and became the factory of the world. And how did they become the factory of the world? Which brings me to my third point, which is they did it on the basis of industrial policies. Very early on in their development process, they created industrial policies within a planning framework and managed to absorb labor very quickly, managed out of agriculture, workers moved out of agriculture. So, in other words, they not only transformed agriculture, they also created jobs for the young entrants into the labor force. And we really need to learn from the lessons of industrial policy. Which brings me to my sort of final point, and I want to sort of spend 2 or 3 minutes talking about what an industrial policy needs to be at our current juncture. Because if we do not have an industrial policy and an industrial strategy, we will never be able to create the jobs that we need to create. We will never be able to move workers out of agriculture in the way that we need to. I believe, and I've written about this in a new book that's coming out, Planning for a 21st Century India, Cambridge University Press is about to publish. There are 7 components of what an industrial policy should be. But the unfortunate part is that neither the previous government managed to implement its national manufacturing policy, which came up with the national manufacturing policy in 2011, nor did they manage to implement their 2012 electronics design and manufacturing strategy. And unfortunately, in the last 4.5 years, this government has been talking about an industrial policy, Make in India, but unfortunately, Make in India seems to be pretty much confined to ease of doing business, very important. No one's underestimating its importance, and also confined to raising foreign direct investment. But if private investment is not rising generally, then FDI alone is not going to do it. So what are the 7 components of an industrial strategy at our stage of development, which I want to dwell on very quickly? 1, it's absolutely critical that we have to articulate industrial policy. The government has apparently got a draft, it's sitting somewhere in the Prime Minister's office or in the cabinet, it hasn't come to fruition, but the industrial policy must be aligned with trade policy. What do I mean by that? It means an import policy which creates the possibilities of manufacturing growth in India. What we have currently is a situation where at Diwali, even the Ganesh and Lakshmi and the lights that we use in our homes come from China. Which means we have to have an industrial policy, an import policy which is aligned to an industrial policy. Second, we have to have an export policy which uses our surplus labor in labor-intensive manufacturing. I've written about this, don't have the time to talk about it. This implies the second element. We need packages for labor-intensive manufacturing in our country. There are 5 or so industries which are labor-intensive sectors in manufacturing, which account for about 60% of total manufacturing employment. Those are textiles and garments. Those are wood and furniture. There's leather and footwear. And there's, of course, food processing. These are the 4 or 5 sectors which need packages. Only 2 of them, of the 4 or 5 industries that I'm talking about, have been given packages, and I think we need more, the rest of them. The third dimension needs to be a focus much more on cluster development for these labor-intensive manufacturing. There are about 1,400 modern industry clusters around the country, and then there are about 4,500 traditional artisanal clusters. We've seen some of that work going around this conference, this festival itself. Absolutely critical that we need to have a far more focused cluster development strategy, which unfortunately we haven't still got, not in the 10 years that cluster development had begun to be taken seriously. Fourth, since these clusters are the hub of unorganized manufacturing employment, it's critical that urban development in our country is focused on these clusters in the towns in which these clusters are located. Yes, we do have an Amrut program. However, unfortunately, we haven't chosen towns, tier 3, 4 cities in the Amrut program based on where the clusters are, where the jobs are, where you attract more jobs, where you attract more investment in order to create the jobs for young people who are getting educated. The fifth, coastal economic zones, which this book talks about. Yes, it's a very good thing because we need to absorb our surplus labor and get engaged in global production networks as well as in global value chains. There's some thinking about this, some movement in the Vizag-Chennai corridor, but not enough movement fast enough for these industrial and infrastructure corridors to happen. Sixth, we need a much greater focus on R&D in innovation. This book talks about it. However, there is a real issue as far as manufacturing is concerned and the connection of R&D and innovation. If you don't have an industrial policy and a thriving manufacturing, what will R&D lead to? What will innovation lead to? All that is happening, unfortunately, is 2 things. One, our public sector research centers and research institutions are doing very well on creating patents, on moving up in the world league table of publications, but are those publications and those patents being translated into things of commercial value which are solving the problems of our nation? So what has happened in respect of R&D is that lots of international firms are coming in and setting up R&D centers in our country growingly, but our own private sector firms are not doing that. And secondly, as I was saying, the public sector institutes, we haven't created the ecosystem to convert patents into commercial value things. And finally, we need a much greater investment in mineral development as a foundation for industry. That's all I wanted to say. So at this point, I'm going to sit down and open with a question to Mr. Amitabh Kant as to why we still don't have an industrial policy. Sir.
It would be brilliant introduction and a number of range of issues that you raised.
Rightly, as you said, India's growing. It's growing at about 7.5% per annum.
Even higher rates of 9 to 10% year after year, for 3 decades or more, to be able to lift, as you said, a very young population above the poverty line. It rarely happens in history that you have such a light dependency burdens, and rarely has a country not created wealth. And this, to my mind, is the biggest social and economic transition that is taking place across the world. That the population in India is getting younger and younger, and the population across the world is getting older and older. But I think this demographic dividend is available to us only till 2040. And I think the challenge is not in terms of merely the industrial policy, but what does India need to do to accelerate its growth at 9 to 10%? So let me try and look at beyond your question of just the industrial policy. I think first and foremost is that India had made itself extremely complex, very complicated, and a very difficult place to do business in. So over the last 3 to 4 years, we've tried to focus on making India easy and simple. A lot of scrapping of laws, digitization of departments, cutting across human intervention. And that's why we've jumped up 65 positions on the World Bank Ease of Doing Business. But I think this is still work in progress, and India needs to do much more to make itself very easy and simple. Secondly, whatever industrialization you do, unless you are not a part of the global supply chains and global value chains, it's not possible to penetrate global markets. And most often, Indian companies look at the domestic market. No country in the world post-World War II has grown on the back of domestic market. So India needs to become an exporting nation, and for India to become an exporting nation, you need to think in terms of size and scale. And over the years, we've never manufactured for global market, and this would require you to do standardization of your products. This would require you to produce to global standard. This would require you to ease up on your labor laws. This would require a lot of manufacturing to international standards. And this, to my mind, is critical. But one of the things that's happened, because India has not done that manufacturing to size and scale, one of the things that's happened is the complete restructuring of the manufacturing process is taking place across the world. The fourth industrial revolution and the digitization of the manufacturing process, the complete digitization of the manufacturing process, and the coming in of artificial intelligence. And this will completely provide a huge, huge advantage to medium and small enterprises in India. And India is essentially a land of MSMEs. And they actually account for almost 50% of the total industrial production. They account for a very vast proportion of the jobs they create. And the advantage in terms of artificial intelligence is enormous, simply because by 2030, according to a recent study by Accenture, shows that the total output on account of artificial intelligence will be 15.7 trillion, which is more than the output, more than the GDP of China and USA put together. Now this requires really a massive, complete technological jumping in terms of MSMEs. This requires us to do a lot of hand-holding of our MSMEs, which will enable small really to be more efficient, to use technology, and therefore you need not get into what you talked about, large enterprises, large clusters. The story of China cannot be repeated in India, let me assure you, it's not feasible. You could probably do it in textiles, you could probably do it in footwear, but for large-scale manufacturing of the kind of economic zones like Shenzhen, or Wuxi, which China did, it's not possible anymore. It's difficult and it's impossible, and it's not necessary to replicate the story of China. What's more important is to break away from the Anglo-Saxon system of education, which we are trying to do, and to ensure that we make Indians far more innovative and use emerging trends of technology to provide that skills and those technological advantages to our MSMEs to make a quantum jump. But more important than that, I think it's not possible for India to grow at high rates of 9 to 10%. If the western part of India and southern part of India grows, but the eastern part of India remains backward in terms of education, health, and nutrition. If 1 in 2 women remain anemic, if 1 in 3 child remain stunted, it's not possible for India to grow. So you need massive structural reforms in health, education, and nutrition. And to my mind, you need a huge reforms in these social sectors, and they will become the key drivers of India's growth. And lastly, to my mind, the key challenge for India is how does India urbanize? Because every minute as we speak here today, there are 30 Indians who are moving from rural areas to urban areas. If you go by the latest McKinsey study, by 2050, you will have 700 million Indians getting into the process of urbanization. And this really means that the challenge for India is that in the next 5 decades, we'll be doing more urbanization than what India has done in the last 5,000 years. The challenge is to create 2.5 Americas in the next 5 decades. And when America urbanized, land, gas, water were all cheaply available. They were all cheaply available. You could create cities like Atlanta where 99% of the people could travel by cars. But land, gas, water are all scarce commodities in India today. So how does India do innovative, sustainable urbanization? And how does it recycle its water, recycle its weight? How does it do compact, dense urbanization? Because it's very important to understand that cities hold just 3% of the earth land mass, but they account for 82% of the global GDP. 82% of the global GDP comes from cities. And therefore, India must make its cities Mumbai, Calcutta, Chennai, Bhopal, Indore, they must become the drivers of India's growth. And if cities become the drivers of India's growth, then you'll have huge growth in India taking place. But while cities account for 82% of global GDP, they also account for 75% of the pollution of the world. And therefore, India's huge opportunity is in urbanization, to my mind, and how it does this process of urbanization in a far more innovative manner, in a far more sustainable manner, through compact urbanization on the back of public transportation, on the back of recycling, is a huge challenge. But one of the key things that's happening in India, Santosh, to my mind, is that India is becoming an extremely innovative society in many, many ways. I mean, you see a tremendous energy, vibrancy, and dynamism in our startup movement. It's unparalleled what many young people are doing today. I mean, you have a young girl called Pranshu Bhandari who's taught, she started a startup with Culture Alley to teach Mandarin and Japanese. And soon she realized that the demand was for English, and she's taught in 4 years' time 45 million Indians how to speak English. No school, no college has been able to do this. There's another girl called Aditi who runs Imbibe in Rajasthan, and she tracks students longitudinally, latitudinally on how students are moving up or down on different subjects using artificial intelligence. I mean, phenomenal work is being done by many startups in health, education, many of these areas. So this kind of energy and dynamism the world has never seen before. And one of the things which the government has done to start these tinkering labs in school where we are providing robots, 3D printers, Internet of Things at the class 6 level. At the class 6 level, we are breaking away from the Anglo-Saxon system of bookish education into all these new fourth industrial revolution technology. And to my mind, our challenge is to create 100,000 tinkering labs in school in the next 4 to 5 years. And that will truly transform and disrupt our Indian education system. So unlike what you said about large manufacturing zones, those days are passé. You can't repeat the China story. You need to make your MSMEs far more dynamic, far more vibrant. You need to bring in artificial intelligence. You need to move into the fourth industrial revolution, provide the backward-forward linkages. But more important, bring in structural reforms in health, education, and nutrition so that the eastern part of India, which has remained backward, moves forward. And therefore, you'll have growth with equity and you'll have growth with jobs.
Great. Thanks very much, Mr. Kant. That's very good and provocative. I think you misunderstood me when I said that I'm talking about only large capital-intensive manufacturing. I think we have to build large capital-intensive manufacturing. But in addition, we need to focus on SMEs, MSMEs. In fact, we need to ensure it's not working. So we need to focus, in fact, on micro, small, and medium enterprises in our clusters, and that's where MSMEs are. That was the thrust of my argument, that we need to focus much more on cluster development, which brings me to the urbanization point that you made, and I'll hand over to Ila at this point. I mean, you say, for instance, that our big metros have to drive the growth in our economy. I think they will be willy-nilly part of the growth process because that's where a lot of our industry is in any way concentrated. I think I was making the argument that we need to decentralize our investment into tier 3, 4 cities. They need to attract much more of our rural youth into manufacturing, and I think if we were to be providing skill development for young people closer to where they are coming from, then, and if the focus was simultaneously of skill development centers located near clusters, which are near where the jobs are, near where the young educated from rural youth are, then I think it would be a strong strategy. Which, Ila, what is your view on what we have just been talking about?
Same mic we use? Yeah. It's not working.
Okay, let me begin by disagreeing with you and by agreeing with Amitabh. which is that India cannot now follow the China model. What China did 25 years ago, we can't go chase the China model. It's today not feasible for us, both economically, politically. The world is a different place, technology is different. And I think for most of us, we've just got used to thinking that, oh, we should do large-scale industry, export-oriented. China did that and succeeded. I think as Amitabh very correctly said, we cannot be following that China model. And it's very important to understand why we can't, because that takes us to what we can do and what we need to do. There's a shift in emphasis. It's not enough to say, yes, we'll go after large-scale manufacturing industry and be part of the global value chains, and we will do MSME, because then we just stay exactly where we are. That is, we go on neither path. First, as you said, both of you said, technology is very different today. Today, it is we have capital, we have accumulated capital, it's digitized, artificial intelligence. And imagine, are we a country where we can actually move in people from villages, put them in hostels, barracks, call them whatever, make them work? No, so that was the China model. I mean, for us to think that we'll be part of those large global value chains producing our own Ganeshas and our own diyas at very low cost, that we will do all the labor reforms in a country where every political party has a trade union, which is quite rare by global standards. So that we'll be able to do those labor reforms. So politically, I mean, no government has been able to do the kind of labor reforms that it has itself talked about, whether it's the government where you were in the planning commission or where Amitabh is in Niti Aayog. So
what's the way forward then, Ila?
Exactly. I mean, first let's agree that this is not our easiest way forward if that's what we're going to chase. So I would say that if we look historically at India, we look back at 1,000 years, at 2,000 years. In fact, where we are in Bhopal today, I mean, this is a place where humans have lived for 10,000 years, as we saw yesterday in some of the rock shelters, and that they've been moving around. People of India have been trading, have had businesses and trade for thousands of years, for hundreds of years. There was no planning by one state, and yet we were very prosperous. So what is it that changed? For 25 years, we had a command and control economy where the government would decide what is to be produced, by whom, for whom, how much it is to be sold by. We tried to plan everything, and like all other planning models, it was not successful, and we did not succeed. When we did reforms and we liberalized, by liberalization and reform, I think the simplest way to understand is where the government gets out of the process of intervening actively. When instead of trying to run business and plan everything and say, okay, this corridor will go from here to here, you will produce, this is a good sector, you will produce in this sector, I will give money for this sector. Instead of doing that, when the government gets out of business, that is when entrepreneurship can flourish. So it is the software sector where there was no government, where it was not government planning that, oh, you will have these many companies, you will have export-oriented companies. Actually, the sector where you had the least, where the government did not come in and say, we want you to do export-oriented growth, is exactly where you got the export-oriented growth, which was the software sector. So you let people be, you allow people to do business. And this does not mean you just completely get away from regulation. You regulate the economy, you facilitate. Let me just give one example, which is the area in which I work on, which is financial sector reforms. So when in our previous model, the 25 years that I am talking about, the model from the mid-60s, 70s, and then that starts getting dismantled in the 80s when you start realizing that this is not giving us growth. But that model was that while on the real side the government was deciding who produces how much, for whom, at what price, price of input, price of output, and so on. On finance, because no business and no production can be done without money. So on finance, what was done was we take over all the banks, and the banks were nationalized. And after that, it is the government that decides which sector gets how much. So you get priority sector lending. So much goes away to the government. So it used to be 40% and now it's close to 20%. That all bank deposits that, there should be an increase in branches all over the country, so you get deposits. And then basically once you've collected all the money that people have saved in the economy, then the government decides, along with the regulator, the government decides where does the money go. Okay, 20% or 40% to government. So much to priority sector lending, where we define which are the sectors. We define small scale industry as one of the sectors, and I'm going to come back.
I'm being told to wind up in the next 7 minutes. I'm sorry. Apologies. Really sincere apologies. I don't know. But go ahead.
How much time?
7 minutes.
Couple of minutes, because we have Mr. Mehrishi to go. No, Mr. Mehrishi.
Okay, whatever, 2 minutes?
If that's
Fine.
okay.
So what we did not have was allowing industry to be financed by a financial sector which could decide which were the industries that money could go to. So it was government and the banking regulator continuing to decide what sector, what size. So I was taking the example of small scale industry, and I'll take those 30 seconds back because Santosh interrupted me. So the example of small scale industries, that you decide the scale at which it is to be produced, and then you get credit because you are small scale. For agriculture, and we know what happened to that's everyday news, what's happening to agriculture and agricultural credit to exports and so on. So bulk of the savings of the people of India are till today in the hands of public sector banks, bulk of them, so 80% of the banking system, and it's a bank-dominated economy where the banking regulator and government together decide where the money goes. Now, if anybody tells me that we can have small-scale industry growth, or we can have an India model or an alternative model where the government continues to decide where will the money go, I think that's a no-go. That can't happen. People who think that we'll have entrepreneurs, we'll have all these demographic dividend by innovation because young people will start their own businesses, but we won't give them money. We won't allow the system to decide where the money goes. We will decide where the money goes. I think as long as that happens, and that's what I mean when I say we need to do things differently if we want to transform this government, we have to get away from that mentality. We have to get away from that command and control. We need to begin with the financial sector, where we have to allow money to go where banks who can enter and exit the system see where there is a profitable business. Businesses will start, businesses will fail, there will be uncertainty, and that's got to be part of the new world where we are going to be in. Today, MSME, which is a priority, credit to MSME is 6% of bank business loans. The OECD average for the rest of the countries, the average is 42%. Why is it 6%? Because we focus so much on it. Once we start saying this is a target, mudra loans, we've had schemes throughout. Once we start saying this is a target, people start gaming the system. So you need to get out of the command and control mindset. You need to get out of the command and control regulatory system you have. And you need to let people choose where the money flows. And only then can we get a transformation.
All four of us, I think, are totally agreed that we have to do things differently. There is no question about that. Mr. Mehrishi, one of the ways I believe that we need to do things differently is that our administrative system, our bureaucracy has to become much more dominated by domain expertise and by professionalization and by specialization. That is what distinguished the East Asian model across the East Asian countries. That's how they managed to have an effective industrial policy within a broad planning framework. So my question to Mr. Mehrishi then, sir, you've spent 35 years with the IAS, and we've begun to talk about lateral entry. There's a chapter in the book about lateral entry. However, lateral entry is not going to solve the problem really, because we have a very large civil service. Is it possible, for instance, for specialization to be focused upon after 15 years of generalist civil service? The same IAS should spend about 4 or 5 years specializing, studying, training, and then the last 15 years of their service they remain in the field of human capital development, in the field of economic services, in the field of infrastructure. Is that possible, sir? A professional civil service.
I stand up to speak because I am not sure the mics will work. Also, it limits me in time because I can't keep standing for long. So, really, I'm an auditor now, and I must begin with an audit observation that the organizers kept the session too short. Because we have the enthusiasm of Amitabh Kant and the expertise of Ila to listen to, and I wished we had more time to listen to them. I'm also not able to give as rousing a speech, talk as Amitabh. And of course, whatever I say now in the next 3-4 minutes is with apologies to my guru and teacher in economics, Ila Patnaik. So, India's journey has been remarkable in many ways. And there is a huge positive upside to what India has achieved in terms of retaining and continuing to be a democracy with pretty functional and independent institutions, and with the reduction in poverty, which is quite remarkable. So we have grown, when in 1960 our per capita income was $60, they are about $2,000 now. So we have grown quite remarkably. But that hides a story which is much to worry about. And some statistics, I'll just quickly read out, that have we followed the right path? Have we done the right thing? Have we done enough? So some of the statistics are very disturbing. For example, India is ranked 103 out of 190 in the Global Hunger Index. In the Human Development Index, we are ranked 130 out of 189. In per capita income, we are ranked 140 out of 188 countries. And in the education index, which is actually very disturbing because it impinges on everything else, we are ranked 145 out of 191 countries. So obviously we have done something very wrong. Why are we here? And why haven't we have the success of, say, South Korea or China? So interesting statistic there also, that in 1961, the per capita income in China was $57, India was 61, and South Korea was 63. Today, we are 2,000, I said that's quite remarkable, but China is about $10,000, and Korea is nearing $30,000. So why have we not done, say, as well as China or Korea? There is something wrong with the model. We are stuck with an ambassador car, and we are trying to raise it at 10%, 12% growth. We can't. So my basic submission is that we are stuck with the wrong model. Whatever name you give it, command and control, commanding heights, whatever name you give it, we are just stuck with the wrong model. If you actually pose this, Ila was right in saying there are political limitations. If you actually pose this to some policy-making circles in Delhi, they'll, compared to China, they'll tell you, no, that's not a democracy, that's a dictatorship of a party. So you point to South Korea, and they say, no, that's too small a country. So then my question is that if we're a large country and a democracy, are we doomed to be poor or not as well to do as anywhere else? So that is the basic thing, and we were also afflicted by a disease that began in Europe that turned many countries various shades of red. And I beg to submit that a great thinker, a great man, Karl Marx, was absolutely wrong in thinking that human nature is consistent with each according to his capacity and to each according to his need. So that's where we went wrong, I think, and which is what led to all this command and control and commanding height nonsense, which has put us where we are today. So my second submission, therefore, is that whatever else we do are all band-aids, they are all paracetamols. This is not the solution to the disease that we are facing today. And so no matter what policies you have, manufacturing, etc., whatever else you do, concentrate on MSMEs, nothing is going to help because to my mind, they are all band-aid solutions and they are not repairing the fracture that we have suffered. Nothing, no amount of denting and painting the ambassador car is going to help unless we get back to my submission, simple mind. I have a simple mind that we have to get back to the basics. We have to get back to realizing school level economics that factors of production are land, labor and capital. We need to reform all three. The political challenges of doing so are huge. Ila spoke to you about reform in the capital market, FSLRC. We need to do that. Land is in such a mess that even taxes are not guaranteed. So all of you who bought land or sold land know that very often, or you have relatives who have bought land, paid honest money, and then got into title disputes. Labor market is as anti-labor as you can imagine. So we have a strange situation where if a person is earning 6,000 rupees a month, we actually deduct 40% of his salary towards his so-called welfare. He never gets to see that welfare, unfortunately. Whether it is in terms of EPF or in terms of what is the other thing? Health, employee state insurance. So that poor man never gets to see that, but we deduct, and so we are sitting on a corpus in EPF of some 40,000 crores, something, I don't know the figure now. So we are, there's something wrong with everything we do, and as Ila rightly pointed out, that the only success story we have had in India is the one sector that government didn't intervene, and that is the software sector, the IT sector. So I think therein lies the answer to Mr. Mehrotra's question and to the third part of my submission, that basically government needs to do less. So it's not a question of IAS or IPS or anybody else. Government just needs to do less. In India, government has tried to do everything and it has done nothing well. Education and health are two sectors where government has a huge role, huge responsibility. They are what you call merit goods, economists call merit goods, and those merit goods have suffered. So today, none of us, none in this audience, and none outside this audience who teach in these schools, the government schools, send their children to government schools. And yet we are pumping billions and billions of dollars in Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan. What use is that pumping if that is not giving any learning outcomes to the children for whom it is meant? So that's something government, we haven't done well. And yet we wanted to manufacture HMT watches and tractors. We wanted to run hotels, airlines, planes, what have you, power sector, anything and everything, banks. So basically, we need to do much less. Government needs to do less. Government needs to get out of sectors which are not its concern, where and the animal spirits, as Manmohan Singh said, of the Indians can actually ignite and deliver. And we don't have much time, as Mr. Mehrotra pointed out. We don't have much time because our demographic dividend is time bound. And this demographic dividend would be a liability unless we do some major reforming our system, unless we give up completely and junk the ambassador car and move on to the next generation of technology and cars. So that's my conclusion, and I hope it answers most of your questions raised. That India has 1,000 plus centrally sponsored schemes. Most of them are aimed to remove or end poverty. Have they done so? Today, Government of India runs these schemes, and are the poor in India better off with so many pro-poor schemes than the poor in Korea? So, are we really helping the poor by doing what we are doing? Take another example. Recently, because of the trade war between China and USA, the Chinese share of exports, garment exports to America, came down by about 6.6%. And guess what replaced it? Oh, 5.5%, sorry, 5.5%. Who were the major nations who took advantage of it? Vietnam, whose share grew by 6.2%. Bangladesh, whose share grew by nearly 1%. And of course, there was India, whose share grew by 0.2%. So that is, these are the fundamental questions that we all need to ask, that what's wrong with the model that we have. And therefore, to conclude, I just say that we need to dismantle the command and control regime, the commanding height system, the nationalization. We need to roll back nationalization. We need to look at a different model of development altogether. It may not be a Chinese model, it may be another model, but we can't go on doing what we are doing, that is not delivering goods. We need to go back, as I said, to the basics, high-level school economics, and government needs to do less. But what it does and what it needs to do, like education ahead, it really needs to do much better than it is doing.
Quite right, sir. But just my last question, professionalization of the civil service.
See, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter, you're overruled. So, see, I know. So basically, you see, as I said, that I'm looking at it from a different lens altogether. So, I'm saying that government must do less, which automatically implies that if you do less, you're only in regulatory activities. You're not into areas where you require specialization. So, when in India nothing worked, we have seen that era in the 1970s in Delhi. You didn't have power, government and the power sector. You didn't have telephones, government and the telephone sector. Normal waiting time was 10,000, 10 years or 10,000 rupee bribe. We didn't have, you couldn't buy a car if you didn't have the money. There was a 3-year wait list or a black on the ambassador, and a 6-year wait or a black on the Fiat car. So no, not cars at all, they were rickshaws. But basically one thing worked in the 70s in Delhi. And those of you who are of my age and lived in Delhi in 70s or experienced Delhi in 70s, one thing worked. 24/7, winter or summer, fail safe. We all had relatives coming in from abroad at 2 in the morning or leaving at 2 in the morning by the Lufthansa service to Europe. The black and yellow taxi was always there. And what was the great about the black and yellow taxi model? Because government didn't nationalize the taxi service. If government had nationalized the taxi service, you would have had a member taxi in Planning Commission. You would have had many nice, sexy reports on taxi services in India, but no taxis. So basically, what did we do in the taxi model which we got right? We enabled. We gave some private entrepreneurs a little room on the footpaths of Delhi to make a 10 by 10 office. We gave him an out-of-town telephone connection so that he could have a telephone. And the rest he did. And then he made the investment. He slept out in the winters in the cold, but he provided the service. And what else did you do? You regulated. So you regulated prices. You regulated the fare you could charge in the day and at night. That's what government should be doing. Enabling and regulating, not doing.
Fair enough. Thank you very much, Mehrotra. Just let me give him an opportunity to close in 1 minute, if you don't mind.
Please, 30 seconds, sir.
30 seconds, 15 seconds if you wish. 15. What is clear is that all of us are agreed that things have to be done differently. However, we want to remind all of you as well as our panelists about the following. Over a 100-year period from 1880 to 1980, the now industrialized countries experienced a rise in per capita income, the structural transformation. And as a rise in per capita income was happening, just as has been happening in our country for the last 25 years, the size of the state grew and grew and grew. So public expenditure to GDP in 1880 was about 11%. By 1980, it was about 40 to 45%. And what did the state invest in? It invested in health, in education, and in social transfers, in social insurance. That's what it invested in. That's what enabled the size of the state to grow. So that's what the state needs to focus on. We are all agreed on that. Thank you very much indeed. The panel, big hand.
Thank you for watching the session from BLF 2019. Kindly subscribe to our channel for more such videos.